The most dangerous royal meeting was not held before cameras, crowds, or cheering courtiers. It happened behind a closed door, between a father carrying the weight of the throne and a son who had reached the edge of duty. In that private room, William did not simply ask for time, space, or sympathy. He placed abdication on the table, and Charles understood at once that the monarchy had entered its most fragile hour. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William arrived at Windsor, carrying more than anger. He carried the quiet fear of a man who had spent his whole life preparing for a crown, and had suddenly begun to question whether that crown was worth the damage it might bring. Windsor, one of the monarchy's oldest royal homes, mattered because private meetings there were not casual family talks. They were where pressure could be hidden behind stone walls and polished silence. Charles waited without the usual circle of advisors, and that absence mattered, because no formal council, a senior group that normally advises the monarch on serious royal matters, could soften what father and son were about to say. No aide could translate pain into protocol. No courtier could rescue either man from the truth. The closed door changed everything. William looked controlled, but control was not calm. The prince chose each word as if one wrong sentence might break the king in front of him, and Charles knew it. He watched his son place the sealed folder on the table, watched his hand pause before letting go, and understood that the future king had not come to complain. He had come to warn. Abdication, the act of giving up the throne or stepping away from the direct royal path, was not spoken like a threat. It landed like a final alarm. William made it clear that if the family crisis continued to be managed through silence, if Catherine and the children remained exposed to palace pressure, then he could no longer pretend inheritance was only honor and not sacrifice. Charles did not explode. That made the moment more dangerous. The king rested one hand on the folder, lowered his voice and asked, "Is this truly what you want, or what you have been forced to consider?" William did not answer quickly, because the question struck deeper than accusation. It exposed the wound beneath everything. He was not trying to abandon duty, he was trying to survive it. And as Charles listened, he began to see that this meeting had not begun with his son's warning. It had begun with people around both men, pushing them toward a breaking point neither wanted to admit. But before anyone could understand why William reached that terrifying word, the palace had to confront who was standing in that room. Not just as royals, but as wounded human beings. To the world, looked like a question of succession, duty, and royal order. Inside the palace, it was far more painful. This was a father facing the possibility that his son no longer trusted the future he was being handed. It was also a son, standing before a monarch, trying to explain that loyalty had become a cage. Between Charles and William sat years of grief, expectation, silence, and fear. Charles carried the throne like a late-life burden, not a prize. He had waited for decades, judged by the public, tested by scandal, and watched every family fracture become a national argument. Succession, the royal process that decides who follows the monarch, mattered here, because William was not just a son in pain, he was the next link in that chain. The king knew that if the prince lost faith, the whole structure would tremble. He had spent his life defending the crown, and now his own heir was questioning whether that crown could still protect the people inside it. William carried a different weight. He thought of Catherine. He thought of the children. He thought of his mother, and what palace pressure had taken from her before anyone admitted the cost. The prince did not speak like a man hungry for escape. He spoke like a man terrified that history was circling back toward his own family. That was why his warning cut so deeply. Charles heard abdication and felt rejection, not only of the throne, but of the life he had endured to keep it alive. William saw that pain cross his father's face, and still he did not take the words back. Camilla's name hung in the room before either man said it. The queen consort had become tied to questions of access, influence, and household authority, and those questions had slowly hardened William's distrust. Camilla was not physically there, yet her presence pressed against the conversation, because choices made around her circle had changed how the prince viewed the palace itself. Catherine's absence was even louder. William made it clear that his wife's well-being was no longer a private concern to be politely managed. Catherine had stood through too much in silence, and he would not let that silence become a royal habit. Charles lowered his eyes, wounded by the truth, but unable to dismiss it. William stood firm. Not cruel, not reckless, but changed. The meeting only made sense when traced back to one specific incident that turned private concern into open alarm. And that incident, buried behind palace politeness, became the hidden spark that pushed William from quiet frustration into a confrontation with the king himself. Every royal crisis has a moment people later pretend was minor. A glance, a seating change, a sentence spoken too sharply. But for William, the breaking point came during the Windsor Thanksgiving ceremony, when Catherine was quietly moved away from the senior family position at the last minute, while Camilla's household took control of the order of arrival. It was not what the public saw, it was what William understood. William noticed the change before anyone explained it. Catherine remained composed, but the prince saw her hands tighten around the service paper as the room moved on, polite and unforgiving. The Windsor Thanksgiving ceremony mattered, because a royal ceremony is not just a public event. It is a carefully arranged display of rank, respect, and family order. When Catherine was shifted away from the senior position, it told William something deeper than seating. It told him that access, image, and influence were being shaped around him without his approval. Catherine did not protest. She did not need to. Her silence struck him harder than any accusation. Charles saw it too, and that was what wounded William most. The king appeared uneasy, his expression tightening for a moment before he looked away. But he did not reverse the change. To the prince, that silence felt like permission. Charles may have believed he was avoiding open tension, but William saw a father choosing calm over protection. Camilla's household had taken control of the order of arrival, and that mattered, because a household is the private team that manages schedules, appearances, and access around a royal figure. The queen consort was not speaking loudly, yet the influence around her was suddenly impossible to ignore. William learned the deeper truth later that evening. A documented account from a senior household aide confirmed the adjustment had been discussed in advance and dismissed as a minor optics correction, a phrase that made the prince's anger turn cold. Optics meant public image, the way a royal moment is arranged so the world reads it a certain way. But to William, this was not image. It was Catherine being quietly reduced, while everyone pretended nothing serious had happened. Catherine had carried pressure with grace for years, and he would not let grace become an excuse for others to move her aside. The next morning, a private note reached William, confirming that similar changes were being considered for future ceremonies involving Catherine and the children. The prince read it once, then again, and something inside him settled into resolve. That note became the object he carried into his secret meeting with Charles, and once it was placed on the table, the confrontation could no longer be avoided. By the time William faced his father behind closed doors, he was no longer asking whether something had gone wrong. He was demanding to know who had allowed it to happen. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. That made it worse. William entered quietly, set the note on the table, and waited for Charles to read it. The king's face changed before he spoke. The room seemed to shrink around them, as father and son confronted the sentence neither wanted to say aloud. Then William delivered the line that turned a family dispute into a constitutional earthquake. William did not explain the note at first. He let it speak for him. Charles read the paper once, then again, and each second made the silence heavier. The ceremony note mattered because it was not gossip or wounded pride. It was a written sign that palace arrangements around Catherine had been discussed without the prince's consent. A palace arrangement means the private planning of roles, access, order, and public position inside royal events. To William, that made the slight impossible to dismiss. Catherine had not been moved by accident. The children had not been mentioned by accident. Someone had started shaping the future around his family without asking the man expected to carry it. Charles set the note down slowly, and William saw the truth reach him. The king understood that his son had come prepared, not emotional, not reckless, not looking for comfort. The prince told his father he could not inherit a system where Catherine and the children were treated like pieces on someone else's board. Charles answered with restraint, saying the crown survives because people inside it learn when not to react. But William's face hardened. He told the monarch restraint without protection was surrender. And for the first time, the king looked less like a ruler and more like a father who knew he had failed to stop the wound before it deepened. William then said the line that changed everything, "Then I cannot inherit this in silence." The words did not shake, because he did not offer them as drama. He offered them as warning. Inheritance, the royal passing of duty from monarch to heir, mattered here because William was not rejecting privilege. He was questioning whether the next generation could survive the same pressure that had broken so much before. Charles asked whether his son was challenging him as king or pleading with him as a son. William looked straight at him and answered, "Both." Charles did not move. William did not soften. The confrontation had forced the monarch to look beyond one note, one ceremony, one painful sentence. It forced him to ask who truly held power around him, who had guided decisions in his name, and whether the monarchy had become vulnerable from inside its own walls. But the deeper shock was not William's warning. It was what Charles discovered when he began tracing the power behind the decisions that had pushed his son this far. Power inside a palace rarely announces itself. It moves through schedules, seating plans, private papers, whispered approvals, and the careful timing of who is allowed near the monarch. After William's warning, Charles began to see the machinery around him differently. What once looked like administration now looked like pressure. And in the quiet after the meeting, one trusted courtier watched the king realize something devastating. Charles ordered the review before the palace could bury the shock. He wanted the path traced. Who approved the Windsor Thanksgiving ceremony change? Who saw the seating adjustment? Who allowed Catherine's role to be reduced? And who decided William did not need to be warned? A household chain, meaning the line of private staff and senior voices who handle royal schedules and decisions, mattered because it showed whether the mistake was careless or guided. The king expected confusion. Instead, he found pattern. Small decisions had moved through informal channels, softened with careful words, and presented as practical choices before anyone measured their emotional cost. Charles felt humiliation rise before anger. He had believed he was balancing fragile relationships, keeping peace between William, Catherine, Camilla, and the wider family. Now the monarch saw that peace had looked like absence to his son. The prince had not accused him because of one ceremony. He had accused him because protection had failed at the exact moment it was needed. A documented palace review revealed that senior voices had framed the changes as necessary adjustments, a phrase that sounded harmless until the king read it beside William's warning. Necessary for whom? Adjusted by whom? And at whose expense? Camilla's household appeared again and again in the chain. The queen consort's private circle had gained unusual influence over ceremonial access discussions. And that mattered, because ceremonial access decides who stands close, who arrives first, and who appears central to the monarchy's future. Camilla was not named as shouting an order or signing a command, yet the influence surrounding her created the perception that Catherine was being managed instead of respected. That perception was enough to poison trust. Charles removed his glasses, pressed his fingers against the page, and one senior courtier later revealed in a private interview that the king whispered, "I missed the warning signs." The sentence broke the room. Charles realized the issue was no longer a single slight, a single note, or one painful conversation with William. It was whether the future monarchy trusted the present one to guard its own heirs. The king had found the invisible hands, and once he saw them, he could not pretend they were harmless. That discovery triggered immediate fallout, because once power was questioned inside the palace, every relationship began to shift. And when the first consequences reached Camilla, The palace learned that private decisions can wound more deeply than public disgrace. Camilla did not receive the news in a grand announcement. She received it in a private sitting room, through a message delivered with careful wording and unmistakable meaning. Certain household channels were being reviewed, certain ceremonial decisions were being paused, certain access would now require direct approval from Charles. For a woman who had fought decades to stand beside the throne, the implication landed like a door being closed from the inside. Camilla sat motionless after the message was read. She did not ask for it to be repeated, because the queen consort understood every word. Household channels, meaning the private routes through which royal staff and senior advisors shape schedules, access, and ceremony, were no longer being trusted in the same way. That mattered because this was not only about paperwork. It meant the quiet influence around her was being pulled back before it could touch William, Catherine, or the children again. The change did not remove Camilla from royal life, but it reduced the reach of those around her, and that was the wound she felt first. Charles had made the decision without turning it into public punishment. That made it colder. The king wanted order, not spectacle, but protecting William meant confronting the woman beside him, and that choice reopened old pain. Camilla had spent years fighting to stand near the crown, and now the same palace that had once adjusted itself around her was drawing limits around her circle. She felt blindsided. She felt betrayed. Her expression hardened as she understood that William's warning had not remained inside one room. It had changed procedure. It had changed trust. It had changed the balance of the household. Camilla asked the question no one wanted to answer. Did he threaten abdication? The aide lowered their eyes, and that silence gave her everything. Abdication, the act of stepping away from the throne, or the path toward it, mattered, because William's use of that word meant Charles had heard more than anger. He had heard danger. The queen consort understood then that the prince had reached the one place the king could not ignore. Her influence had not been challenged by gossip. It had been challenged by the future king's breaking point. Charles called later, and the conversation began carefully. It did not stay careful. Camilla asked whether he still trusted her judgment, and the king paused too long. That pause was the answer she feared. The call ended abruptly, leaving both of them bruised by what loyalty had become. Yet the true turning point did not come through offices, documents, or restrictions. After the cold machinery of consequence began moving, father and son were forced back into the only place where the monarchy could still be saved: a private conversation with no witnesses. The second meeting was different. No folder waited on the table. No courtier stood near the door. No polished phrase could protect either man from the truth. William arrived prepared for another battle. But Charles did something his son did not expect. He apologized before defending himself. In that single act, the room changed. The future king stopped speaking like a man cornered, and began speaking like a son, still hoping to be heard. Charles had requested the meeting himself. He did not summon William through staff, and he did not hide behind royal language. The king wanted his son in a private room, away from formal offices, because formal offices turn pain into business before the heart has time to speak. A monarch is the reigning king or queen, the person who carries the crown's authority. But in that moment, Charles knew authority was not enough. He needed trust. William needed proof. Both men understood why this mattered. If the next king believed the present one could not protect Catherine and the children, then the future of the monarchy was already cracked. William admitted the word had cost him. Abdication had not come from anger alone. It had come from fear. The prince told his father he had felt trapped between duty and the terror that silence would endanger his family's future. Catherine had carried pressure without complaint, and the children were growing up inside the same system that had wounded generations before them. William said he did not want to walk away, but he could not keep walking forward if every step demanded more silence from the people he loved. Charles listened differently this time. The king apologized for mistaking William's restraint for acceptance, and that confession struck harder than any command. He admitted he had feared losing control if he confronted the palace machinery too sharply. Palace machinery, meaning the hidden network of staff, influence, schedules, and private approvals that shapes royal life, mattered because it had begun making family choices feel cold and unreachable. Charles told his son that he now understood the danger. William did not soften at once, but his anger shifted. It became grief. It became exhaustion. It became a son finally hearing that his father had seen the wound. William withdrew the immediate abdication threat only after Charles agreed to direct consultation on every future ceremonial or household decision affecting Catherine and the children. The king also promised written protections for the Wales household, making clear that the future king's family would no longer be managed through informal influence. The private truce steadied both men, but it did not erase the danger. What had been whispered behind palace walls was about to become a national reckoning, and the public would judge not only William's warning, but Charles's response. By morning, the secret meeting was no longer secret. Britain woke to a headline that felt impossible. William's abdication warning, the private meeting that shook the crown. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras gathered before sunrise, and by mid-morning, crowds had formed along the gates. Some looked stunned, some looked protective, others looked angry. But everyone understood one thing. This was not another royal disagreement. This was the future trembling in public view. William felt exposed before he felt vindicated. The prince had fought to keep the crisis inside the family, and now the most painful word he had spoken behind closed doors was printed across a front page. Buckingham Palace mattered because it was not just a building. It was the public face of the monarchy, the place where national feeling often gathers when royal life turns historic. That morning, the crowd outside its gates told the palace something no statement could hide. People were not watching from a distance anymore. They were choosing sides with their faces, their voices, and their fear that the future king might truly walk away. Charles watched the coverage in silence. The king did not turn it off, even when the broadcaster repeated the phrase, "Abdication warning," again and again. A broadcaster, meaning a presenter or journalist speaking to the public through television or radio, shaped the story as a test of whether the crown could protect its own future before public trust cracked. That framing wounded Charles because the nation had learned of William's despair before the family had fully healed it. The monarch understood the danger. If people believed his son had been pushed to the edge, then this was no longer palace gossip, it was a national judgment. William's anger burned quietly. He hated that Catherine and the children were now part of public debate, yet he also knew the leak proved how serious the warning had become. The prince heard that crowds outside the palace had begun chanting his name, not as rebellion against Charles, but as a plea for William not to leave the path ahead. That sound carried a terrible meaning. Success had made him beloved, but suffering had made people protective of him. The future king had wanted privacy. Instead, he had become a symbol of a monarchy under emotional strain. Charles heard one senior broadcaster declare in a recorded morning segment that the crown had survived scandal before, but rarely had it faced a warning from the heir himself. The king sat still at those words. William remained silent publicly, but his silence no longer looked weak. It looked deliberate. Public reaction forced the palace toward one final message, not of denial, but of emotional settlement. And when that final message came, it revealed what the secret meeting had truly changed inside the monarchy forever. In the end, William did not abdicate. Charles did not lose his son. Catherine was not left unprotected. And Camilla was not destroyed, though her influence was sharply contained. The secret meeting became something larger than a leak, larger than one family argument, larger even than the word that terrified the palace. It became the moment the monarchy finally admitted that duty without honesty can break the very people chosen to carry it. William emerged wounded, but steadier. The prince no longer sounded like a man trapped between silence and sacrifice, because Charles had finally heard the fear beneath his anger. The Wales household mattered because it was not just William's private family circle. It was the living future of the crown, the branch that would one day carry the monarchy forward. That was why the reform struck so deeply. The king changed the private handling of family authority, especially around Catherine, the children, and every decision that touched their place inside royal life. He understood, at last, that protecting the crown meant protecting the people who would inherit it. Charles chose correction instead of pride. The monarch could have buried the crisis, denied the leak, and treated his son's warning as betrayal. Instead, he accepted that the abdication threat had been a final alarm, not an act of disloyalty. Abdication, the act of giving up the throne or stepping away from the direct royal path, had terrified the palace, because it exposed the cost of silence. William had not wanted to abandon duty. He had wanted to stop the institution from repeating old wounds on a new generation. The king saw that truth, and it changed him. Camilla remained beside Charles, but the queen consort's circle no longer moved through the palace with the same quiet reach. She was not erased, but her influence was contained, and that boundary carried its own verdict. Catherine's position was no longer left to informal pressure. William's family would not be shaped from behind closed doors without him. The prince had forced the monarchy to face what it feared most: that loyalty without protection becomes cruelty, and tradition without honesty becomes danger. The meeting's meaning was final. The crown survived because father and son chose truth over performance. Charles saved more than a succession line. He saved a bond that had almost broken under the weight of duty. William did not walk away, but he made sure the monarchy could never again pretend his silence meant consent. This was the night the crown came closest to losing its future king, and the night Charles finally understood that saving the monarchy meant listening to the son who nearly walked away. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.